Now back to some international news. You know, Syria has kind of not been on the front pages lately, but the human tragedy of astounding proportions does continue there. And with the peace talks not set to start for another 6 weeks, there is sadly no end to the suffering in sight. For a look beyond that news, here's Liz Trotta's Sunday commentary.
The war in Syria, birthplace of Christianity, cries for humanitarian attention, especially in this season that marks the coming of the Son of Man. Syria's needs are basic and dire: food, water, shelter, and safety for a people besieged by the violence of Islamist and sectarian cruelty. Relief convoys carrying food and medical aid are blocked or attacked. Kidnappings are rampant. And in less than 3 years of the revolution, more than 125,000 people have died in the fighting, half of them children. 2.5 million are refugees in winter, desperate to escape the indiscriminate fire of civil war. The next terror is often a perilous crossing in a rickety fishing boat or an equally dangerous escape over land. Meanwhile, commentators rush to remind us of the 1994 genocide in Rwanda and the massacre of a quarter of Cambodia's population in the late 1970s. In both cases, like today, the world stood by offering only sympathy. For a war-weary America, armed intervention is not an option. The UN has charged Syria's President Bashar al-Assad with war crimes, but he shows no intention of leaving as his own forces gain strength through atrocities and with the help of Iran's surrogate, Hezbollah. Last week, reports surfaced that a group of nations, including Iran, Saudi Arabia, Russia, and the United States, is engaged in direct talks with a coalition of religious militias that calls itself the Islamic Front. The idea is twofold. First, to undercut al-Qaeda, which, contrary to the optimistic claims of President Obama, is making steady gains in Syria and across the Middle East. Secondly, it's an effort to persuade the Islamic Front to attend talks in Geneva next month, a much-promoted meeting aimed at forging some kind of transitional government. Perhaps they might consider finding a way to ease the suffering of those remaining in the country or lingering in the squalor of refugee camps just over the border. Optimism is not running high. Reporting the Syrian story has been described as a roll of dice for reporters and photographers who dare to enter the country. Al-Qaeda and the criminal groups kidnap or execute journalists routinely. One survivor described the country as a place of evil. The Middle East has always been a cauldron of conflict and deceit, especially now that every country seems to have a role in the complicated dynamics of the neighborhood. Trying to keep track of the players is a game of who's on first. At the moment, Saudi Arabia supports those opposed to Assad. Iran is a devout ally of Assad. Qatar supplies weapons to the rebels. Turkey is hosting most of the refugees. Lebanon opposes the Assad regime. Jordan stands with the U.S. And Kuwait, a country we went to war to defend in 1991, is reported to be the source of enormous private cash for jihadist rebel groups. Doesn't this indicate that Syria is a place to avoid? Still, there are humanitarian concerns, rarely the top priority of governments. Frankly, they have no shame. So why not give the private sector a chance? Suppose a dozen or so of the world's billionaires called a meeting to find a way, a physical corridor to deliver aid to the starving refugees. Unbound by bureaucratic red tape, which they can cut with money and influence, the rich men and women of the world might find a way where government always fails. Impractical? Perhaps, perhaps not. It's worth a try.